There is a profound paradox in the spiritual journey that few dare to confront openly. For centuries, countless souls have knelt in prayer, voices trembling with desperation, begging an external heaven for mercy, for miracles, for intervention. Yet the very power they seek outside themselves has always resided within, waiting patiently to be recognized and claimed. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this truth stands unwavering. The divine creative force was never separate from human consciousness. Jesus himself embodied this revolutionary understanding, not as a distant deity to be pleaded with, but as a living demonstration of what dwells within every being. When someone finally grasps this, everything changes. The paradigm shifts completely. Why does humanity continue to search the heavens for what lives in the depths of awareness? The conditioning runs deep, embedded through generations of teachings that position divinity as external, unreachable, and conditional. Prayers become negotiations, rituals become transactions, and faith becomes a desperate hope that something out there might finally respond. But what if the entire framework was inverted from the beginning? What if the power attributed to Jesus was not his alone, but a reflection of the infinite creative capacity inherent in consciousness itself? This is not blasphemy. This is liberation. This is the essence of the law of assumption that transforms seekers into creators. The search for salvation outside oneself creates a subtle but devastating powerlessness. It establishes a hierarchy where human consciousness sits below, limited and dependent, while divine power hovers above, distant and withholding. This separation breeds suffering because it denies the fundamental truth that consciousness is not divided. In the teachings discovered through Neville Goddard's work, this division is revealed as illusion. The same power that flowed through Jesus flows through every awakened awareness. The difference lies not in the power itself, but in the recognition and assumption of it. Those who plead with heaven unconsciously reject the kingdom within. Those who assume their divine nature consciously create their reality. How many lifetimes does it take to stop begging and start becoming? The answer lies not in time but in understanding. Jesus spoke repeatedly of the kingdom within, of greater works being done, of believers having the same access to creative power. These were not metaphors designed to comfort the hopeless. These were precise instructions on the nature of reality and consciousness. Yet religious structures often transformed these empowering truths into doctrines of dependence. The revolutionary teacher who demonstrated human divinity became an icon to worship rather than an example to embody. The power he revealed as universal became positioned as uniquely his. And humanity continued to plead with heaven while standing in their own divine authority, unaware and unused. The law of assumption operates with absolute precision regardless of belief systems or religious frameworks. It responds not to prayers spoken outward but to states of consciousness assumed inward. When someone truly grasps that consciousness creates reality, that imagination is the workshop of creation, that feeling is the secret, the entire spiritual quest transforms. No longer is there a need to convince an external force of worthiness. No longer does desperation fuel petition. Instead, there emerges a quiet knowing, a deliberate assumption of the state desired, a claiming of what already exists in potential. This is what Jesus demonstrated. This is what remains available. This is the power that was never lost, only forgotten, waiting within for recognition and use. The majority of humanity approaches their desires from a state of lack, unconsciously affirming through every prayer and plea that what they want does not yet exist. This is the fundamental misunderstanding that perpetuates cycles of longing without fulfillment. When consciousness operates from absence, it creates more absence. When awareness dwells in wanting, it manifests more wanting. The teachings found in Neville Goddard's works illuminate this with stunning clarity. The law of assumption does not respond to what is asked for, but to what is assumed as already true. This distinction separates those who endlessly seek from those who consciously receive. The power Jesus embodied was not in his ability to ask better, but in his capacity to assume completely. He lived from the end. Consider how deeply embedded the pattern of external pleading has become in spiritual practice. Hands fold, heads bow, eyes close, and words flow outward toward something imagined as separate and superior. The very posture reinforces the belief in powerlessness. Yet consciousness requires no intermediary, no petition, no permission. Bruce Lipton's research in epigenetics reveals that belief literally rewrites biology, that perception controls genetic expression, that environment responds to internal states. This is not mystical poetry. This is measurable science confirming ancient wisdom. When someone assumes a state of being rather than begs for a change of circumstance, every cell responds, every neural pathway adjusts, every quantum possibility collapses into the reality aligned with that assumption. The body itself becomes evidence of consciousness creating. What happens when the shift occurs from asking to assuming? The entire relationship with reality transforms. Instead of looking at circumstances and then praying for them to change, consciousness first changes within, assumes the feeling of the wish fulfilled, and allows external reality to conform. This reversal feels counterintuitive to minds trained in material causation, where action precedes result. But consciousness operates by different laws. In the dimension of imagination, everything already exists. Every possibility, every potential, every version of reality sits waiting for consciousness to select it through assumption. This is what Jesus meant by asking and receiving, by believing it done before seeing evidence. He understood that consciousness is causal, that states assumed within manifest without. How often does someone declare what they want while simultaneously feeling its absence? The words say one thing, the emotional state communicates another, and the law of assumption responds to the state, never to the words. This is where most prayers fail. They emerge from desperation rather than conviction, from hope rather than knowing, from future longing rather than present assumption. Neville Goddard taught that imagination must be deliberately entered, the desired state must be felt as real now, the internal experience must precede the external manifestation. This requires a complete reorientation of consciousness. It demands that someone stop relating to their desire as something distant and begin experiencing it as something present. The feeling is the secret, not the asking. There exists a subtle violence in constant pleading that few recognize. It reinforces victimhood, strengthens the belief in separation, and trains consciousness to identify with limitation. Every time someone begs heaven for what they already possess the power to assume, they unconsciously reject their divine nature. They position themselves as less than, as dependent, as powerless. Yet the teachings consistently point toward empowerment, toward recognition of consciousness as the only reality, toward assumption as the mechanism of creation. This is not about abandoning prayer, but about transforming its nature. Prayer becomes assumption. Petition becomes claiming. Hope becomes knowing. And the power that was always within finally gets directed consciously rather than dispersed through desperation toward an imagined external source that never needed convincing. The contrast between living as a creator and living as a beggar defines two entirely different human experiences. One moves through life assuming states, embodying desired realities internally before they manifest externally, operating from a consciousness of fulfillment. The other moves through life reacting to circumstances, pleading for change, hoping that enough suffering or devotion will finally convince an external force to intervene. Both are exercising creative power, but only one does so consciously. The law of assumption makes no distinction between conscious and unconscious creation. It simply responds to whatever state consciousness predominantly occupies. Those who assume lack create more lack. Those who assume abundance create more abundance. The mechanism is impartial, absolute, and always active. Neville Goddard often emphasized that imagination is the only reality, that the three-dimensional world is merely shadow, and that consciousness is the substance of all creation. This sounds abstract until applied practically. Every single thing that exists in the material world was first imagined. Every invention, every building, every relationship, every circumstance began as a movement within consciousness before appearing without. This is not metaphor. This is literal creative process. When someone truly understands this, they stop giving power to external conditions and start directing power through internal states. They recognize that the outer world is effect, never cause. They see that circumstances reflect consciousness rather than determine it. And they begin to deliberately assume the states that correspond to their desired realities. What would happen if someone approached their deepest longing not with desperation but with calm assumption? The energy would shift completely. Instead of the frantic vibration of wanting, there would emerge the settled frequency of having. Instead of the tension of seeking, there would be the ease of possessing. This internal shift is what creates external transformation. Joe Dispenza's work on neuroplasticity demonstrates that repeated mental rehearsal creates the same neural pathways as actual experience, that the brain cannot distinguish between vividly imagined events and physically lived ones. When consciousness assumes a state repeatedly, biology adapts, perception adjusts, and reality reorganizes to match. This is why assumption works. This is why feeling the wish fulfilled manifests. This is the scientific validation of spiritual truth. The question arises, why does this understanding remain hidden from so many? Part of the answer lies in the comfort of victimhood, the familiar identity of powerlessness, the safety of blaming external forces for internal states. It requires immense courage to claim full creative responsibility, to acknowledge that current reality reflects past assumptions, to accept that consciousness has been creating all along whether aware of it or not. This realization can feel overwhelming at first, but it also offers the only true path to liberation. Once someone recognizes that they have been unconsciously creating limitation, they simultaneously recognize they can consciously create freedom. The same power that built the prison holds the key. The same consciousness that assumed lack can assume abundance. There is a delicate balance between acceptance of what is and assumption of what can be. Many spiritual teachings emphasize acceptance to the point of passivity, suggesting that wanting anything reveals spiritual immaturity. But the lessons from Neville Goddard's work reveal something different. Desire itself is divine, indicating directions consciousness wishes to explore and experience. The issue is never the desire but the relationship to it. Approaching desire from lack perpetuates suffering. Approaching desire through assumption creates manifestation. Jesus did not teach suppression of longing. He taught fulfillment through consciousness. He demonstrated that the kingdom within contains everything, that assumption grants access, that feeling precedes form. This empowers desire rather than denies it, transforms longing into knowing, and turns the spiritual journey from renunciation into conscious creation. In John chapter 14, verse 12, there appears a statement so radical that most religious interpretations have softened its impact to make it more palatable. The verse reads that those who believe will do the works that were done, and even greater works than these. Each word deserves careful examination. Those who believe does not refer to intellectual acceptance of doctrine, but to those who embody the consciousness of their divine nature. Will do the works indicates certainty, not possibility, an inevitable expression of awakened awareness. And even greater, shatters any limitation, any hierarchy, any belief that divine creative power belongs exclusively to one figure in history. This verse is a direct transmission of the truth that consciousness, when recognized and assumed, operates with the same creative authority regardless of which human being channels it. The phrase, even greater works, dismantles the entire structure of external worship and replaces it with internal empowerment. If the works of Jesus represented the ceiling of what consciousness could achieve, the statement would make no sense. But if Jesus was demonstrating the inherent potential of awakened human consciousness, then greater works become not only possible but expected as more beings recognize their true nature. In the lessons learned from reading Neville Goddard's works, this verse confirms the law of assumption perfectly. Jesus assumed his unity with divine consciousness completely, without doubt, without hesitation. He lived from the state of I am, which is the name of God itself, the creative power speaking existence into being. Every person has access to this same I am, because consciousness is not divided, only awareness of it differs. Why then does humanity continue to position Jesus as the exception rather than the example? The answer reveals a deep discomfort with claiming divine creative power. It feels safer to worship the extraordinary than to become it. It feels more comfortable to plead with someone who achieved what seems impossible than to assume the state that makes it natural. Yet this very positioning contradicts the teaching. Jesus repeatedly pointed away from himself as unique and toward consciousness as universal. He spoke of the Father within, the kingdom within, the belief that moves mountains, the faith that manifests reality. These were instructions, not demonstrations of exclusive privilege. The pain of humanity stems largely from this misunderstanding, from seeking outside what was always within, from begging for power that was never withheld. The validation needed here is profound. Every moment spent in desperate prayer hoping for external intervention was not wasted, but misunderstood. The longing was real, the pain was real, the seeking was genuine. But the framework was inverted. The divine being petitioned was never separate, never withholding, never requiring convincing. Consciousness itself is the divine creative force. Assumption is the method. Feeling is the activation. When someone finally understands this, grief and relief arrive simultaneously. Grief for the years spent searching outside. Relief that the search is finally over. The power was always present, always accessible, always responsive. It simply required recognition and deliberate use through assumption rather than desperate petition through pleading. This changes everything about spiritual practice and daily living. No longer does consciousness kneel before heaven. Instead, consciousness assumes heaven, embodies it, feels it real, lives from its truth. This is not arrogance. This is accuracy. This is what Jesus demonstrated and taught. The same I am that spoke through him speaks through every aware being. The same creative authority that manifested his reality manifests everyone's reality. The difference lies only in recognition and assumption. Those who know this consciously create their experience. Those who don't still create their experience, but unconsciously, often assuming limitation, lack, and powerlessness. The invitation stands eternal. Recognize the power within, assume the state desired, feel it real, and watch consciousness create what has been internally claimed. When consciousness awakens to its creative nature, the entire mechanism of reality becomes transparent. What once seemed like fixed circumstances reveals itself as malleable reflection. What appeared as unchangeable external conditions shows itself as solidified past assumptions. The shift from unconscious to conscious creation does not change the law itself, but transforms the experience of living completely. Someone who recognizes they are always assuming states, always generating reality through consciousness, can no longer blame external forces or feel victimized by life. This recognition carries profound responsibility. Every circumstance, every relationship, every condition reflects back the state consciousness has predominantly occupied. This truth empowers completely while demanding absolute ownership of one's creative output. Consider practical application. Someone desires financial abundance but spends mental and emotional energy dwelling in thoughts of lack, worry about bills, anxiety about future security. Their prayers for prosperity go unanswered not because heaven is deaf, but because consciousness is creating from the assumed state of poverty. The law of assumption responds to the state, not the words. To manifest abundance, consciousness must first assume abundance, must feel financially secure now, must occupy the state of having rather than wanting. This might seem like pretending, like denial of current reality. But current reality is simply past assumption solidified. To change what manifests tomorrow, consciousness must assume differently today. This is not positive thinking. This is deliberate state selection and embodiment. Another example reveals the same principle operating in relationships. Someone longs for a loving partnership but internally assumes unworthiness, expects rejection, or dwells in past hurt. Every interaction becomes filtered through this assumed state, and reality confirms it repeatedly. Not because love is unavailable, but because consciousness creates through assumption. The external world cannot deliver what consciousness has not first claimed internally. When that same person shifts their assumption, feels loved now, occupies the state of being cherished, carries themselves as someone deeply valued, everything reorganizes. Not through external manipulation, but through internal transformation that shifts what consciousness projects and therefore what reality reflects back. This is how assumption manifests in every area of life. The bolder revelation here is that nothing exists outside of consciousness. Not distant heavens waiting to respond to prayers. Not separate circumstances imposing themselves upon passive victims. Not random chaos requiring external rescue. Everything is consciousness pushed out, assumption crystallized into experience, internal states made visible. This understanding initially feels destabilizing to those accustomed to believing in objective external reality. But once integrated, it becomes the most liberating truth possible. If everything is consciousness, then everything can change through consciousness. If assumption creates reality, then new assumption creates new reality. There are no exceptions, no limitations, no conditions that override this fundamental law. Jesus demonstrated this by walking in complete assumption of his divine nature, and greater works await those who recognize the same power within. How does someone bridge the gap between intellectual understanding and embodied knowing? Through practice. Through deliberately assuming desired states despite contradicting circumstances. Through feeling wishes fulfilled before evidence appears. through persistent occupation of new internal realities until external reality conforms. Neville Goddard taught specific techniques, imagining from the end, constructing scenes that imply the wish fulfilled, repeating them until they feel natural, allowing consciousness to harden into fact what was first only imagined. This is not prayer to external forces. This is deliberate consciousness creation. This is assuming the power that Jesus revealed as universal. This is claiming divinity not through arrogance but through accurate understanding of what consciousness is and how it creates everything experienced as life. The existential impact of recognizing consciousness as the sole creative force cannot be overstated. It dissolves every excuse, every justification for remaining stuck, every belief that change requires external permission or intervention. When someone truly grasps that they have been creating their reality all along through unconscious assumption, and that they can now create consciously through deliberate assumption, the weight of victimhood lifts entirely. What remains is pure creative potential, unlimited by circumstance, unrestricted by history, unbound by what appeared fixed. This realization can feel terrifying at first because it eliminates all hiding places, all external blame, all comfortable powerlessness. But beyond the terror lives absolute freedom. The same consciousness that assumed limitation can assume liberation. The prison and the key were always the same thing. Imagine consciousness as an infinite ocean, and individual awareness as waves upon that ocean. Each wave appears separate, distinct, with its own shape and movement. Yet every wave is made entirely of ocean. There is no wave substance different from ocean substance. The wave cannot be separated from the ocean, cannot exist without it, is forever and always nothing but ocean expressing momentarily as wave form. Human consciousness operates identically. Individual awareness appears separate, feels isolated, seems small and powerless compared to the vastness of existence. But every individual consciousness is made entirely of the infinite creative consciousness that sources all reality. There is no separation except in appearance. The power Jesus demonstrated was not his alone, but the ocean recognizing itself as ocean while appearing as wave. Everyone is that same ocean, temporarily experiencing itself as individual wave, yet never for one moment separate from the infinite source. The connection between body, mind, and spirit becomes undeniable when consciousness is understood as primary. The body is not separate material housing an isolated mind and occasionally touched by distant spirit. The body is consciousness densely concentrated, belief made cellular, assumption crystallized into flesh and bone. Every cell responds to consciousness, rewrites itself according to belief, manifests the state habitually assumed. Mind is not separate processor analyzing external objective reality. Mind is consciousness in movement, creating the very reality it appears to observe. Spirit is not distant divinity occasionally visiting mortal form. Spirit is the infinite consciousness that sources everything, indivisible, expressing as all forms while remaining forever formless. These are not three separate things requiring integration. These are three perspectives on one unified creative force expressing as individualized awareness experiencing its own creation. What does it mean to live from this recognition rather than merely understand it intellectually? It means assuming desired states despite contradicting appearances. It means feeling wishes fulfilled before evidence materializes. It means occupying consciousness of health when the body shows sickness, consciousness of abundance when circumstances show lack, consciousness of love when experience shows loneliness. This requires profound trust in the law, unwavering faith in consciousness as creative, persistent assumption regardless of how long external change takes to reflect internal shift. Most abandon the practice too soon, assume briefly then return to old states when immediate evidence fails to appear. But consciousness hardens assumption into fact through persistence, through sustained occupation of the desired state, through refusing to return to identification with limitation. This is the practice Jesus demonstrated constantly, the unwavering assumption of divine nature despite every external challenge. The invitation now becomes clear and unavoidable. Stop pleading with heaven and start assuming heaven. Stop begging for power and start claiming power. Stop searching for divine intervention and start recognizing divine nature. The kingdom is within, the creative force is consciousness, the method is assumption, the secret is feeling. Everything needed for complete transformation exists right now within awareness, waiting not for acquisition but for recognition and deliberate use. No more prayers to distant deities. No more hope that enough suffering will finally earn mercy. No more powerless waiting for external salvation. Only conscious assumption of desired states, persistent feeling of wishes fulfilled, and patient trust that consciousness creates without exception what it assumes as true. This is the teaching. This is the power. This is what Jesus revealed and what remains eternally available within every being. There exists a simple practice that embodies everything shared here, a symbolic gesture that shifts consciousness from pleading to assuming, from separation to recognition. It begins with finding a quiet moment, a space where external noise fades and internal awareness becomes primary. In that stillness, consciousness turns inward, not searching for something missing but recognizing what has always been present. The practice involves placing one hand gently over the heart, feeling its steady rhythm, acknowledging the life force pulsing through every cell. This physical touch serves as anchor, reminding awareness that divine creative power does not exist in distant heavens but lives within the body itself. Then comes the deliberate statement, spoken softly or held in silence, I am. Just those two words, the name of God, the identity of creative consciousness, the recognition of source rather than limitation. As those words settle into awareness, feeling begins to build naturally. Not hope for future change, but recognition of present reality. Consciousness deliberately assumes the state of the wish fulfilled, whatever that desire may be. If healing is desired, wholeness is felt now. If abundance is sought, security is experienced now. If love is longed for, being cherished is assumed now. The practice requires dwelling in this assumed state, allowing it to feel natural and real, letting it permeate every layer of awareness until it no longer feels like imagination but simply like truth. This is where transformation occurs, in the sustained occupation of the desired state despite contradicting circumstances. Consciousness held steadily in a new assumption eventually hardens that assumption into material experience. For those discovering this understanding for the first time, or for those who have searched long years for answers that finally resonate with deep knowing, there is value in staying connected to teachings that reinforce this truth. Subscribing to sources that consistently remind consciousness of its creative nature, that validate inner authority over external conditioning, that point toward assumption rather than pleading, serves as helpful support. Notifications can ensure regular reminders when new insights become available, creating a steady stream of empowering input. This is not about dependence on external teaching, but about choosing what influences awareness deliberately. Consciousness shaped by empowering truth creates empowered reality. Consciousness shaped by limiting belief creates limited reality. The quality of input directly determines the quality of output in the creative process of living. What would happen if every moment of desperation transformed into deliberate assumption? If every prayer of pleading became an act of conscious claiming? If every experience of separation dissolved into recognition of unity with the creative source? The answer exists not in theory but in direct lived experience, available immediately to anyone willing to shift from unconscious to conscious creation. The same law that operated through Jesus operates through every aware being without exception. The same creative force that manifested what appeared miraculous manifests what appears ordinary. The only difference lies in recognition and deliberate use of the power that has always been present. No external permission is required. No worthiness must be earned. No complicated doctrine must be mastered. Only consciousness assuming desired states, feeling wishes fulfilled, and persisting until internal reality becomes external experience. The search for salvation outside oneself ends the moment consciousness recognizes itself as the creative source of all experience. Heaven is not a distant location to reach through suffering or a separate deity to convince through pleading, but a state of being to assume, a consciousness to embody, a reality to feel true now regardless of contradicting appearances. Jesus embodied this truth completely, lived it without wavering, demonstrated its absolute power through every action, and taught clearly that the same creative authority resides within every being willing to recognize and claim it. The pleading stops when the assuming begins. The sense of powerlessness ends when creative responsibility is fully embraced. The illusion of separation dissolves when consciousness recognizes itself as the infinite expressing through the individual, the ocean experiencing itself as wave, the divine deliberately creating through human form. Consciousness is not a small separate thing seeking to connect with God. Consciousness is God seeking experience through infinite individualized forms, and assumption is the precise mechanism through which that divine creative intelligence deliberately shapes what it experiences as reality.